Hi everyone, I'm Sue Terry, the Secretary of the Friends of the NFSA, and I'd like to welcome you to our first webinar for 2025, which we are presenting from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. We acknowledge them and their elders, past, present and future, and we're grateful for their care of this country that we Canberrans love to call home. Now, today's webinar is being presented by Ray Edmondson, President of the Friends of the NFSA. He was also Deputy Director of the NFSA since its inception in 1984 and until he retired. And he is now Curator Emeritus of the NFSA. Today, he's presenting an updated version of a paper he gave last year at the Australian Historical Association conference on the birth of the NFSA as a separate institution. Over to you, Ray.
The National Film and Sound Archive was established by Cabinet Resolution on 26th of March 1984, reconfiguring the National Library's existing film and sound archives as a separate institution. This move was firmly opposed by the National Library and its Director General, Harrison Bryan. In publicly recalling the event 4 years later, Bryan wrote these words: "That operation had all the characteristics of rape, the cynicism, the utter lack of scruple, and the plain treachery that accompanied that particular crime against society. We were outgunned and outmaneuvered. We were rolled by experts." This was a serious charge about which rumours lingered on for many years. Was he right? Were treacherous forces at work? Was the library attacked and rolled by experts? This is a long and complicated tale here, and I will do my best to abbreviate it within the limits of a webinar. I begin in 1935 with two contemporary organisations, the Melbourne-based cinema branch of the Department of Commerce, and it was the Government Film Production House of the day, and the Canberra-based Commonwealth National Library, predecessor of today's National Library of Australia. By cabinet decision, these two organisations, in collaboration with the Film Distributors Association, jointly set up the National Historical Film and Speaking Record Library to preserve films and sound recordings of historic interest. In modern parlance, a National Film and Sound Archive. In Australia, film preservation was not a new idea. It had turned up in the press, on and off, since, well, almost since the Salvation Army's Limelight Department had recorded on film the birth of the country, the Federation ceremonies on the 1st of January 1901. Films had since been lodged in various memory institutions. This move brought Australia formally into line with the simultaneous establishment of the pioneering institutional film archives in Europe and the United States, but with a crucial difference. It included sound as well as film. Well, so far so good. But you never know what's around the corner. And in 1938, the cinema branch was closed. The following year, World War II began. This brave beginning went into limbo. In 1945, with the war's end, and under entirely new circumstances, the Commonwealth National Library established a 60mm documentary film lending library, part of a new national network of government public film libraries. Its initial staff of 3 included a young Rod Wallace. This was a distribution activity, not a preservation one. It is presumed, and there are no confirmatory records, that the division inherited the Canberra-based safety film component of the pre-war historical film and speaking record library, but as an unstaffed sideline. In 1953, the residual nitrate film collection, gathered pre-war by the cinema branch in Melbourne, was transferred to the film division in Canberra and became known as the division's historical collection. Commonwealth National Library head Harold White was so enthusiastic about his new film division, often called the National Film Library, that he envisaged it occupying its own building alongside the future National Library edifice. But other library staff questioned why the glamour section, as it was derisively called, was part of a national research and depository library at all, and not with that region. The film division was a bolt-on, professionally dissimilar and administratively self-contained. It had no intrinsic connection to the rest of the library, and so it gained no value added from the collection. It eventually drove division head John O'Hara in 1951 to begin campaigning for its separation from the library's hostile administration, as he called it. Harold White brooked no dissent. O'Hara was promptly removed. Just as the cinema branch had been closed in 1938, the winds of change wafted through the unwieldy Commonwealth National Library in the 1950s, after long consideration, a parliamentary committee called Time in 1957. The Patent Committee, as it is known, decided to blow up the whole show, splitting it into three parts. Today, these are known as the National Archives of Australia, the Parliamentary Library, and the National Library of Australia. It almost created a fourth part, but then abruptly reversed its reasoning and caved in to Harold White's special pleading. It assigned the film division to the new National Library for the time being. This three-way split was strongly opposed by Harold White, who lost most of his empire. It left deep underlying enmities for years afterwards. But White had hung on to his film division as a consolation prize. The film division's lending service flourished, but the historical film archive was the poor relation. White refused to allocate any staff to it, not only after the patent split, but right up to his retirement in 1970. Ill-equipped and forced to adopt cheap, inappropriate technical standards, the archive's growth relied on the personal exertions in their private time of successive division heads Larry Lake and Rod Wallace. Unlike the climate-controlled vaults in film archives overseas, Australia's fragile nitrate film heritage reposed and deteriorated in disused explosive sheds. Here's one of them. You can see it today in the reserve at Callum. Unsupported, Wallace and Lake persisted. Many early films were saved, but for many more, it was too little, too late. A future administration of the National Library would burnish its credentials by reinventing this personal crusade as a heroic corporate myth, claiming that but for the library, most old films would have been thrown away, burnt, or left to crumble. In truth, Larry and Rod were swimming against the tide. In an institution primarily concerned with books and papers, films were of inferior status. Funding for the embryonic archive was minuscule. Film copying compared very unfavourably with the cost of books. Nevertheless, White prized the library's prestigious membership of the standard-setting International Federation of Film Archives, or FIAF, even though it consistently failed to honour its membership obligations. But neglect caught up with him. By 1969, FIAF had received so many complaints from Australia that the library faced expulsion from the Federation. The warning letter arrived, and then it vanished from the official file. Alan Fleming, White's successor in 1970, faced pressures and cultural change which forced the library to lift its game. The reborn and politically organised film industry expected professional standards and service. By 1973, Fleming had mended fences with FIAF, established a National Film Archive staff unit, and inaugurated a separate sound archive. Moreover, an overseas expert had now arrived to change the calculus. Jerzy Turplitz, principal of the new National Film and Television School, was a past president of FIAF. He urged Fleming to grant more autonomy and status for the archive within the library. It was then that fears of separation into an autonomous, independent archive began to get real.
I got into it. Now I can record. I'm recording it.
Yes. Led by the new Association for National Film and Television Archive, producers, broadcasters and educators were learning how far Australia's archiving capability lagged behind comparable countries. Over the next few years, successive private and official reports enlarged this concern, while noting the efficacy of the autonomous FIAF Film Archive model. At the same time, growth accelerated so that by 1980, the National Film Archive collection was 10 times larger than in 1970. The Sound Archive had grown exponentially, and both were now serving broad stakeholder communities. Yet, all the advocacy had little effect on library priorities and perceptions. In 1980, Fleming's successor, George Chandler, and the National Library Council suppressed a major Australian Film Commission report on the archive on the eve of Chandler's retirement. The Minister of the day, Bob Ellicott, sent it back to Chandler's successor, Harrison Bryan, requiring some action. Of its 14 recommendations, the cheapest was for the National Library Council to appoint a voluntary advisory committee on the National Film Archive. The Council appointed 6 prominent representative figures from the film and television industry and academia to form the committee. These were Philip Budden, who was the chair, David Williams, Tom Ryan, James Mitchell, Pat Lovell, and James Malone, with Harrison Bryan as an ex officio member. My deputy, Mike Linsky, National Film Archive Curator, served as secretary. As head of films, I attended by invitation, as did some others in the library hierarchy. The committee's remit was to provide advice on any matter relating to the National Film Archive. It joined 9 other existing council advisory committees. These committees met just once a year, and, well, they were good public relations. So the National Film Archive Advisory Committee, convening in December 1981 for the first time, it had no appetite for annual talkfests and long lunches. Bryan and his senior cohort encountered the creative and pragmatic world of film and television. With goodwill, these busy people took their remit at face value, organised their research, introduced Bryan personally to film industry luminaries, and they reconvened with disturbing frequency, sometimes at their own expense. By the time they concluded that the Film Archive was stressed and seriously under-resourced, Harrison Bryan was quickly telling his council that the committee needed slowing down. Bryan angered the committee in June 1982 by introducing draconian access restrictions for the archive, a band-aid solution to the overwhelming demands on the small staff. Noting the public complaints, the Public Service Board actually offered Bryan extra film and sound staff positions, a rare gesture in the midst of a recession. Bryan turned down the offer. The archive tail was wagging the library dog. As we shall see, he does nothing to heed the committee's advice and deal with the limitations on access. Rather, what he perceives is a threat to the sanctity of the National Library itself, in which the committee and certain staff members are complicit. He will address it tactically. Protecting the organisational status quo of the library would take precedence over serving the needs of its users. So, at the critical moment, a second overseas expert made a timely visit. Clyde Jevons, head of the British National Film and Television Archive, recommended commissioning an independent consultant study on the development options for Australia's National Film Archive. The advisory committee agreed. It convened a stakeholders meeting to define the terms of reference for Clark's study. With costs shared between the Australian Film Commission and the National Library, the chosen consultant, recommended by Bryan, was Nicholas Clark and Associates. Clark later turned out to be an old university acquaintance of Bryan and his family. But there was some dirty work at the crossroads. By the time Clark accepted his brief, these terms had been significantly altered by library management without the committee's knowledge. By now, the dire situation of the library's sound archive was commanding public attention. While map curator Dorothy Prescott had publicly resigned over the library's treatment of its map collection. To cap it off, library staff went on strike on the 1st of July 1983 over the discovery of asbestos in the building, and this triggered a 9-week-long picket by the Trades and Labour Council. The National Library was not a happy workplace. At the same time, Bryan was trying to undermine the advisory committee by applying the time-honoured bureaucratic device of reorganisation. The plan was to deconstruct the film archive and the sound archive for good measure while he was at it, and to distribute their component parts to other library sections. This would destroy the committee's focus. The first attempt, amalgamating cataloguing with other collections, proved unworkable. Next, the Sound Archive lost its technical unit to a new preservation branch. Applying the same treatment to the Film Archive's technical unit was imminent, but was forestalled by the commencement of the second stage of Clark's study in May 1983. A progress report in July raised the Advisory Committee's doubts about the study's objectivity. Stakeholder input had not only not been sought, but actually rebuffed. At this point, a young journalist on the Melbourne Age, Margaret Simons, had sensed a larger story, and her report on 8th of July proved the first of many as the saga developed. Pat Lovell, too, was worried and told committee chair Phil Budden that if the library didn't play fair, she would go public. When a fuller draft report arrived in August, it was clear the committee had been sidelined. Without offering supporting data, Clark's recommendations basically affirmed the status quo. So Pat kept her word.
Key staff have resigned. People in the film industry, such as Pat Lovell, producer of Picnic at Hanging Rock, are alarmed about the future.
Our National Film Archive is probably the worst equipped, the most understaffed film archive in the world, considering the size of our film industry, the history of our film industry, and the importance of our film culture. The solution to the problem is for the archive to have autonomy with its own board, maybe within the Department of Home Affairs, and then it can expand, and it also can do the necessary work that has not been able to do. I fear that if the archive stays within the jurisdiction of the National Library and is therefore part of that public service machine, we won't have a National Film Archive within a year.
Key staff have resigned.
Thea Cumming, a journalist that I had briefly met in Sydney years earlier, had since moved to Canberra, and she walked into my office one day in late July seeking a news story on the archive. After serious thought, Mike Linsky and I gave her one. When her article appeared in the Bulletin on the 10th of August 1983, we became persona non grata, and we were ostracised within the library. I didn't know it then, but Prime Minister Bob Hawke had read the article and instructed his senior advisor, Bob Hogg, to fix it up. I also didn't know that the still highly confidential Clark report had by now been leaked to the Australian Film Institute, the AFI, whose chairman, Senator David Hamer, had long taken a close interest in the archive. Realising that time was of the essence, the AFI convened a national conference of film and television bodies, state government agencies, and educators to discuss the report. Clark's team had rebuffed industry input, so in turn, the library was not invited to this conference. It unequivocally dismissed the report's findings. His resolutions, sent to government and shadow ministers, call for autonomy for the National Film Archive and for its closer association with the Library's Sound Archive. The National Film Archive Advisory Committee later endorsed the resolutions. Bob Hogg had been a quiet observer at this conference. He noted the unanimity of the industry on the archive's future. Journalists Margaret Simons and Thea Cumming were also in attendance. The library promptly issued press releases to try and dampen media speculation. These studiously avoided any mention of the AFI conference or its recommendations. Over the next few months, the library went into overdrive, organising newspaper editorials, an information kit for parliamentarians, a letter writing and phone campaign, and supportive statements from professional bodies. Many of these invoked Harrison Bryan's invention of a bogeyman, a cabal of ruthless sectional interests intent on smearing the library and controlling the National Film Archive for commercial benefit. Who were they? The cabal was never defined, but the film industry, it was claimed, had skillfully employed their best lobbying talents to these ends. The claims were nonsense. No sexual interests would bear the cost of managing a public archive which, for copyright reasons, he could never exploit. a showdown loomed at the October 7, 1983 meeting of the National Library Council. At the council meeting, Phil Button and David Williams from the Advisory Committee tabled a 9-page commentary on castigating the now discredited Clark report. It declared the consultant had not fulfilled his brief and should not be paid, and that his conclusions seemed preordained. It added that for 2 years, instead of being valued as a source of serious advice, the committee had been treated as window dressing and possibly deceived. It recommended separating the archive from the library as soon as possible. Phil Button added that the council should have recognised that the child had grown up, could take care of itself, and should be politely encouraged to become independent. He and David left the meeting after lunch just before the future of the archive was publicly canvassed in the Senate, with council members glued to ABC radio as the debate unfolded. You couldn't make it up. The timing was exquisite. Finally, the council got around to meeting with Nicholas Clark and his team. Payment to Clark was approved. It is unclear whether the council formally endorsed his report. In its confidential advice to Minister Barry Cohen following the meeting, the council declared that it had taken into account the advice offered by its advisory committee on the National Film Archive and the report of the independent firm of consultants who were recommended to the library by the committee. Note that the council was scapegoating the committee for choosing Brian's recommended consultant. Further, the committee's confidential commentary was unethically referred by Harris and Bryan to Clark, who in turn threatened litigation against the committee members unless they resiled from their opinions. So much for the library's regard for the film, television and sound recording community on which the archive depended. That community responded accordingly. Academics, producers, educators and donors had their say in the media and Parliament. Here's a selection from The Age, the Financial Review and the Canberra Times. A particularly unvarnished assessment was given to Attorney General Gareth Evans by his advisor, Jeff Gardner, who was former director of the Melbourne Film Festival. The library's record in preservation and service is lamentable and exceeded only by its capacity to tell simple, gross and outrageous lies to its staff, the public and the media. Now to Bob Hogg and Barry Cohen fell the task of piloting a cabinet submission. Arrayed against them were the doyens of the library profession, a National Library Council chaired by the federal president of the Liberal Party, some major government departments, and a bureaucracy skilled in delaying tactics against a new government which might still prove a one-term wonder. As Bob Hogg recollected, it was a rather instructive period for myself in observing at close hand the bureaucracy working to thwart the clear objective of the government. Fortunately, in this case, their efforts were not productive. From the early 1970s onward, when Alan Fleming and his division head Gene White tried to limit Jersey Turplis's influence by tampering with his report to council, the precedent that would be created by losing the archive became a major worry. The library's art collections were ominously being eyed by the National Gallery, and memories of the Patent Committee hovered in the background. Kim Williams, now chair of the ABC, was at the time the chief executive officer of the Australian Film Commission. In his 2022 Rod Wallace lecture, Kim returned to those crucial days of the NFSA's birth. He said, "I well remember the supercharged atmosphere up to and after the announcement. I recall a fervently angry Harris and Bryan remonstrating with me on the phone as to the iniquity of the separation decision and its foolhardy action. Harry was at that time 61 and I was but 31. As politely but firmly as possible, I told him I disagreed." On April 10, 5 days after the announcement, Harris and Bryan addressed the assembled staff of the National Library. Well aware of the theories about sexual interests circulating within the profession, the staff were about to be given the official view of events. The occasion was recorded for posterity, So I'm going to play the first 10 minutes, and please bear with me while we do this, because it didn't really permit editing, which would have destroyed the flavour of the occasion. And I suggest you listen carefully for pauses and intonation. The full recording is on the Friends website.
Thank you all for coming, and I apologise for dragging you away from your work. And with a bit of luck, it won't keep you away from it for very long. But it did seem to me that I should share with you as soon as I properly could my perceptions of what has happened over the last few days, because I think they are quite significant developments for the library. I want to address my comments to 4 separate questions. First, the actual government decision in relation to the establishment of the National Film and Sound Archive. Secondly, the attitude of the library, and more especially the National Library Council, towards the government decision. Thirdly, the implementation of the decision. And fourthly, the future. Now, as regards the decision itself, I'm sure most of you will have read the accounts in the press, and some of you, I'm sure, will have read the Minister's comments in the House, and perhaps the speeches made in both the House and the Senate by members of the opposition and of the Labour Party. But briefly then, and remember I run the risk in paraphrasing a long and complicated document of making minor mistakes. But briefly, the government has decided to set up a National Film and Sound Archive as an autonomous body within the Department of Home Affairs and the Environment. This is to be created immediately on the basis of the immediate transfer of appropriate funds and staff from this institution, and the transfer also immediately of appropriate resources of library material. There's also a statement in the cabinet, there's also a statement made by the Minister that the intention will be to house this institution separately as early as possible. The decision also involves the setting up of an interim advisory committee or council to advise on the development of the National Film and Sound Archive, and that IAC is required to report within 12 months. There also is to be set up an interdepartmental committee to consider the whole question of the Commonwealth's treatment of film and sound recordings, and to consider, presumably, whether there should be any process of rationalisation applied among the various institutions that do collect such material on behalf of the Commonwealth. Now, that's just a brief statement of what the government said, and you should look up the Minister's statement, look at it very carefully to make certain that I haven't inadvertently overemphasised things or omitted things. Secondly, and this is very important, what is the attitude of the library, and particularly the attitude of the National Library Council to this decision? Well, the first and obvious thing is that the Council accepts this decision without question. This is a matter that's been made clear to the Minister from the very earliest outbreak of discussion on this matter in September last year. The first involvement of our chairman in discussions with the Minister was a telex that he sent to the chairman, in which he said that the Council, of course, accepted without reserve the privilege of the government to make decisions of this kind. So there's no doubt, there's no suggestion that the Council or anyone else will drag their feet about this decision. We have also assured the Minister that we will cooperate in the setting up of this of this new institution. However, we have pointed out to the Minister, and I'm now speaking as a member of the National Library Council, and I'm referring to a meeting that the Council had with the Minister last Friday morning. We've also drawn the Minister's attention to the very serious responsibility laid on the library in the National Library Act to maintain and develop a national collection of library materials, including a comprehensive collection of material relating to Australia and the Australian people. And since library materials are defined in the Act specifically as including films and sound recordings, the library at present has an obligation under the Act to maintain and develop a comprehensive collection of films and sound recordings relating to Australia and the Australian people. Now, it is our understanding that in transferring various resources to this new body, we are also transferring that obligation and that responsibility. And therefore, the Council has sought an appropriate assurance from the Minister on behalf of the government that the institution to which we will be transferring this responsibility will indeed be dedicated to the same ends, and that the Minister will use all the resources at his command to see that that new institution is properly supported to enable it to carry out that role. We have no reason to believe that assurance won't be forthcoming from the Minister. It was discussed quite openly with him. The Director General is officially authorised by the Council to press ahead with the setting up of this new institution to the extent that it's dependent on the transfer of resources from the library. Now, the third matter is the way in which this decision will be implemented. Now, in brief, a working party will be set up with representatives on it of the Department of Home Affairs and the library, and indeed, that working party has already had preliminary discussions, and even a stage earlier than that, I have discussed the general conditions of the transfer with Mr. Galvin, the Acting Secretary of the Department. Well, this working party will see how quickly agreement can be arrived at on the matters of transferring staff, finance, and library materials. There will be a stage in their negotiations when they will have to include representatives of the Public Service Board and the Department of Finance. There is no problem about the broad outline of what is to be transferred. We anticipate no difficulty in arriving at agreement on that. But quite clearly, there will be matters of detail that will require quite a lot of careful thought. The Council, at a meeting on Friday, had a paper from me outlining what I believe were the general areas to be transferred and pointing to some of the complications that would have to be settled in proper negotiation. And the Minister has been informed that that is the situation, and he's been asked to accept that the Director General, in engaging these negotiations, will be proceeding constructively, though he will have to bear in mind the continuing responsibilities laid on the library by the National Library Act. In terms of timing, all parties are anxious to have the questions of finance and staff settled immediately. Immediately, I guess, isn't this afternoon, but it won't be far away from this afternoon. The actual staff will have to be, or the positions of the staff will have to be firmly authorised by the appropriate decisions of the Executive Council. The question of finance is one that, once agreement has been reached, doesn't require, as I understand it, any formal documentation. The question of resources will require, in the end, a formal document of agreement between the National Library Council and the new body, since what the Council will be doing is exercising its privileges under Section 7 of the Act to dispose of material in its keeping. There has been no firm discussion yet on the matter of accommodation of the new institution. So, as I mentioned earlier, the intention is that it be accommodated separately as soon as possible. And we know from preliminary discussions with the department that that will be their aim also. One matter which has still to be considered in detail is whether there will be any continuing services provided by the library to the new institution, whether or not it's accommodated temporarily in this building, and that's a matter that will have to be dealt with quite formally. Now, can I come to my fourth matter, the future? I think there will be some of you who quite frankly think that what has happened is some kind of humiliating defeat for the library. I urge you not to take that view. What's happened is that a decision has been made properly by a government with the right to make that decision in the light of all the facts that were put at its disposal. But the National Library Council had every opportunity to provide what it considered were the facts. Whether or not any of us agree with that the particular decision was wise or far-sighted is beside the point. The decision has been made and we must loyally support it. And that's certainly my own point of view about it. We must also note that there certainly are sections of the community that welcome this decision very strongly indeed. So that it just seems to me that at this stage, it's quite pointless to comment on the decision itself or on the way it was arrived at. I see no point in rehearsing the history of the events that led up to it. But clearly it does pose some problems now that the decision has been made. The chairman of the council and I met with the minister on Thursday afternoon prior to his meeting with the council the next day, and we emphasised to him two main points. The first was that it would be absurd to suggest that people wouldn't see this event as possibly likely to be repeated if there was a substantial body of opinion in the community that thought that other sections of our activities or our resources of library materials could be better accommodated at service in another institution. The minister said very clearly that he regarded this present move as a very special case, and he said no more in my time. We can only accept that in the spirit in which it's offered. I can also say that the chairman pressed the minister very hard on this, and we had a very frank discussion about it. The second point, and perhaps the more important one, is that we pointed out to the minister that it would be equally absurd not to accept that there was something very close to a crisis in confidence in the library, both within the library and in terms of our supporters and our users outside. Inevitably, there have been some harsh things said during the media discussions that led up to this decision. The library has been smeared, and I'm not referring necessarily to the immediate protagonist in the discussion. And some of that smear also sticks. The minister accepted that, and he accepted that it was quite necessary not only that confidence should be restored within the library itself, but that the community's confidence in its library should be restored also. And he did undertake that he was prepared to stand up and be counted for the library when appropriate occasions arose. I was very glad to have that assurance. Now, it just seems to me that there are, in the end, some ultimate truths. The first is that the library will go on. It's still a very vital institution, necessary to the Australian people. It has a vital role to carry out, and it is in many ways a very fine institution, which is greatly envied by people both in Australia and overseas. The second thing is that the National Library of Australia is our employer. And that means, I think, that we do owe it at least some basic threads of loyalty. I'd like to think that you agree with me that we owe it a very full measure of loyalty. The third thing is that it's not only our employer, it's our library. It's the nation's library. And it really would be a pretty irresponsible waste of our money, we taxpayers' money, if we don't support the library to the utmost of our power in its task, in our task of serving the nation. There's been considerable criticism, both overt and implied, of the library, but you should also note that there have been very handsome tributes paid to its work in developing the film archive and the sound recording collection. Tributes both by those people who were not in favour of the decision, and also today in press releases from those people who strongly welcome this decision. I suppose, to put it crudely, at least it underlines the fact that the two collections were regarded as important enough for takeover bids to be put in.
Well, no, I'll stop the recording at that point. The well will be further poisoned when the library's 1983-84 annual report was released in November. It published the council's previously confidential advice to the minister, reinforced the sectional interest claim, and blamed the now disbanded advisory committee for the Clark report. The pertinent detail that the committee had chosen Clark on Brian's advice was omitted, of course. It's impossible to kill a good conspiracy theory, and the scuttlebutt that somehow the library had been deceitfully robbed of its film and sound archives spread insidiously in the profession and the bureaucracy, ending up in oral histories and printed publications and continuing to circulate even today. This was aided and abetted at length by Brian himself, writing for years in his retirement. Traditionally, the preservation of Australian films was officially deemed less important than the preservation of manuscripts within the National Library. Stakeholder concerns and advice were constantly deflected, notwithstanding the positive media coverage their work attracted, including the high-profile projects such as the Last Film Search and the reconstruction of For the Turnbull's Natural Life. The film and sound areas were internally seen by many as unconventional and disruptive. As Harris and Bryant put it, There was fairly general approbation throughout the library any time films were seen to get their comeuppance. The calls for separation of the film division, later specifically for the Film Archive and the Sound Archive as well, began in 1951 and turned up repeatedly in reports, letters, conference resolutions and so on for the next 30 years. Was anyone in the National Libraries Council and leadership listening? Didn't the sheer persistence of the issue, peculiar to this part of the library structure, cause some reflection and inquiry at the top? Why did it take so long? Why was it so difficult? Unsupported by reference to specific events or actions, claims like this captured the imagination of many in the Canberra Public Service and the library and archive professions, and they impacted the development of the young institution. It is hard to kill off a good conspiracy theory. The National Library has never resiled from it. The library tacitly promotes it by providing access to oral histories and documents which support Brian's claims. So we are left with three questions. Why did autonomy take so long to happen? Was Brian right? Is there any evidence to back his claim? And how much does it matter? And how does an institution engage in truth-telling about its history? Thank you. There we go.
Okay, right. Chris muted me. I think Len was making noise in the background. Okay, thanks very much, Ray, for making clear what was a long and complex saga characterised by passion, commitment, advocacy, politics, and I think logic as well. I'm sure people have questions and might like to discuss some of those points Ray raised at the end. So now's your opportunity. Would anyone like to discuss the points or ask Ray any questions?
I can start, Sue.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. That was a terrific presentation. Really enjoyed it and very comprehensive. I suppose when you're talking about the truth-telling with the archive, it's about accessibility, right? It's about having all the documents easily accessible and not holding things back and locking things away. And I think I don't really have, that's not really a question, is it? But I think that's the central thing that we're advocating for, and we have been advocating for across its history.
Yep.
Just having that access to what's in those vaults.
Yeah. Well, it's an archive exists to be accessible. That's the point of its existence. So preservation is a means to an end. But also, when you look at the history of the institution itself, you have to realize that the existence of the institution is fundamental to gaining accessibility to the collection. You need to have a fit-for-purpose institution that then can manage your collection, but you also need to know why and how that institution came into existence. And in this case, it was a very long story about becoming separate from the library. Why did the library take so long to, in the end, had to be forced into doing it? Why did it not ask the logical questions much earlier in the piece? And why was it treated so poorly? One of the great tragedies, I think, is throughout the 50s and 60s. Remember, I joined the library in 68, so I came in at the end of this. I know from reading the files that so many opportunities were lost to preserve films. There was no staff, there was no money, and we lost.
Don't repeat yourself, right?
So much material that could have been saved with an effective archive, even with just a few staff. But Harold White wouldn't allow that. I mean, that's part of the story, you know.
But there seems, Ray, that so much reputational damage has currently been done where people now, historians, researchers, filmmakers, they don't have any confidence in donating their materials to the archive because they feel like they're going to be locked away and not accessible. So they're actually giving their notes and archives and boxes to other people, or just throwing them in the dumpster because they feel like that's as good as what's going to happen in the archive. And when we're talking about the truth-telling and accessibility, I feel like a lot of that history isn't going to find its way into the archive.
Yes.
which is also very, very worrying and troublesome.
And that comes down to how far the archive is maintaining its connection with its stakeholders.
Yeah.
Because confidence has to be encouraged. It won't automatically happen, and it comes out of relationships. And this was all spelled out when the FSA was created, and we produced the vision report, the advisory committee's vision report, Time in Our Hands. This was all spelled out. The community around the archive is what sustains it. If that community doesn't have confidence, then we have a serious problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, how do you fix that? Okay, we can complain, we can talk to the archive, we can encourage proper membership of its board, because its board does not consist of stakeholders, and we can write to ministers and all those sorts of things, which is what the Friends does. But really, confidence has to be built. By the archive itself has to be accessible and open and inviting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. No, thanks, Ray. And thanks for everything you've done for many decades now in your advocacy. I'll let others make a comment or ask a question, Sue.
Okay. Anyone else have any comments or questions? I think, Ray, you've covered it all so well, we don't have anything more to add to it.
Oh, surely there's much more to add to it. Because that's only that's the mini version. It's a much more complex story than that can possibly be spelled out in a webinar.
Well, can I ask another question, Ray?
Yeah.
It's probably more of a hypothetical, but if there weren't advocacy groups like Friends of the National Film and Sound Archive and people like yourself, if all of that just stepped away,
yeah,
what would happen to the archive? Like, where would it go?
It wouldn't have existed. It wouldn't exist. Okay.
It wouldn't exist.
But
That's
why.
What do you mean in the future now, Stephen? Steve?
You mean now?
Oh, I mean over the decades, like
Right.
if people had just stepped away and because it relies a lot on that goodwill of
Yes.
people just advocating. Yeah, but sorry, Ray.
No, I think it relies on friends organisations like ours, and friends groups are not computed to the NFSA. Most of the institutions have friends group. Case in point, the National Museum came into existence because of the advocacy of a friends group.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you saw Four Corners on Monday night about the War Memorial, but there's another instance of a whole project going ahead and the input of stakeholders being ignored.
Mm.
And that's what happens, So the existence of groups like this are just utterly essential, not only to creating institutions, but trying to keep them on track.
Yeah.
I think it's worth saying too, for people who may not understand the whole concept of friends, and that is that some institutions have in-house friends groups, like in Canberra, the National Gallery, the Portrait Gallery. Those friends groups are in-house organisations, so they can't act as advocates as the way someone like us, who are an independent incorporated association. The National Library's Friends is also currently an incorporated association, but they have a very close link with the NLA, which provides some money and office space and staff for them to manage their membership business. But I think a lot of our members don't always understand that there are all sorts of friends groups, but only some are independent and able to do the sort of advocacy work that we can do.
Ray, I've got a question. How much support, lobbying, etc., was asked for or received from overseas film archives in terms of what was happening in Australia? And
at the time,
responded
Yeah.
what was happening?
There was some. I think, but the groups in Australia were aware of what was happening overseas, and there's some of us actually had overseas contacts, and there was some of that feeding into it, but mostly it arose from within Australia. We were aware of the context, and we were aware of the models that we were looking at overseas. So I remember a lot of it was informal. I corresponded with people in FIAF, for example, and we had the visit from Clyde Jevons, who was he was out here actually to present some material at the Sydney Melbourne Film Festivals, and so we took advantage of the fact that he was in Australia to visit us in '81, look at what we were doing, and if you like, make a comparison comment on where we were at. So he wrote his report, which was actually published in Cinema Papers. It's a very good report, and out of that report came his suggestion of this study. He also made it clear in his report that he thought the attachment of the archive to the library was a completely wrong thing. You know, it was totally wrong. That was his opinion. But his report was useful in bringing his perspective into the Nicholas Clark study, which of course then the library undermined. So there was the context of knowing what was happening overseas. In fact, in 1973, and this is part of the expanded narrative that we didn't have time for, I did a study tour overseas of visiting film archives in different countries, about 20 of them. And it was funded by the Film and Television School, which was headed by Jersey Turplets. Now, I simply put in an application that went through their process, and it was funded. So my obligation was to write a report about what I'd seen. And I did that. It was a long report, and we were able to adopt practices that I'd observed overseas. But in that report, I had to come up with recommendations. And one of my recommendations, and I was certainly not the first one to say this, was I felt the archive would need to be a separate body. The National Library tried to censor my report before it was sent to Turplets. I contacted Turplets and he said no, it comes straight to us. So they're very worried about what I was going to say. And look, this is just simply one instance, okay? But that report then informed other people and who had their own perceptions of archives overseas and so on. This led to other things. You just see this sort of rolling on. Other people pick up the message. And from 73, 74, it starts to take off. It ends up with the Film Commission stepping in before Kim Williams' time, but with Peter Martin, one of the commissioners, using a clause in their act, allowing them to delve into what was happening in archiving in Australia. And they put up a working party, which consisted of the National Library, National Archives, Film Development School, and the AFC, to comment on, map out where the archive should be going. That report started in 76, was submitted to the National Library Council in 1980, and then George Chandler and the council tried to kill it at that point. So you can see this repetition. So there was that overseas perspective, and then when we get into after the creation of the NFSA and other things happening, such as its absorption by the Film Commission and under a different regime in 2003, when there are quite a lot of overseas voices brought into it at that stage, because the NFSA was much better known, and so we then had overseas commentators buying into the independence of the NFSA. But that's another issue, another story, another issue. So that perspective has always been there.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Or shall we close? Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today and for your patience with our opening challenges. and also for listening so attentively and engaging with Ray's ideas. Most of, if not all of the documents Ray mentioned and showed in his presentation are on our website, on our history page. And I assume we will put the recording, as much as Chris managed to do, up on the website, and we'll email everyone when that's done. So again, thank you very much for attending, and I hope to see you at other webinars in the future. Thank you very much, Ray, for doing this.
Thank you.
And thank you for Chris for persevering and getting it recorded eventually.